Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about why the Trump tariffs are so idiotic. Now, there are a lot of reasons you could give, but we are going to be focusing on one in particular, which is an economic concept. I think the most important for understanding why tariffs are not an effective means of increasing your own economic activity domestically. But before we get into that, a little bit of context.
Starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. So, if you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it.
Now, if you're being generous, this 67% figure is at best just an obfuscation or a deflection, because you're relying on the market manipulation and currency manipulation to pull a lot of the weight here, but neither of those two things are tariffs. So you can't have a reciprocal tariff on something that's not a tariff. But if you qualify and you allow these to be tariffs, to be fair, China has engaged in currency manipulation in the past, and they do this to help them industrialize in order to increase exports, because if your currency's worth less, you're trying to export more. This is very much the logic that is taking place in terms of the United States trying to tariff everyone to some extent. It's so that they can, in theory, export more. But in practice, people slap reciprocal tariffs on you when you do this, which is exactly what we saw in 2018 when the trade war with China and the United States began, which is what this graph is denoting. Instead, what this 67% figure is, when we say it's just a tariff, this is just kind of a lie. China has not been tariffing us 67%. At the start of the trade war, they were tariffing us and the rest of the world roughly 8%. We have the solid line in terms of what they're tariffing us, and this dotted line in terms of what they are tariffing the rest of the world. And the United States between 2 and 3%. Admittedly, this is below what China's tariffing us, kind of at this time period. And it is only after the United States starts to increase tariffs on China that China responds in kind. Something that's perhaps worth noting is that there was a 5% differential at the start of the trade war and only a 2% differential between them at the end of the trade war, or as the trade war kind of reaches this equilibrium where they are charging 21% and the US is charging 19%. But this isn't how this 67% figure was arrived at. Instead, it was arrived at through a blunt instrument method that didn't evaluate currency, manipulation, and didn't evaluate anything in any sort of discernible way. Instead, it's just a very simplistic equation that is charging a reciprocal tariff on something that's not a tariff. This column is denoting the amount that which is being claimed that is being a tariff on the United States. And as we can see here, what is being claimed is that there's a 67% tariff on, being put in by China, European Union 39%. But when you look at the trade deficit, and here we have the trade deficit of each of these kind of countries or, economic organizations, and you divide it by the amount of total exports these countries are sending the United States, this is what you get, this deficit divided by exports figure. And this is, in fact, the number that looks basically identical to the tariffs that are being claimed to be charged the United States. This is how they are determining what these tariffs are. These aren't tariffs, these are trade deficits. Now, there are reasons to want to reduce trade deficit, and generally speaking, trade deficits will reduce themselves, because if you run a deficit for a long period of time, this generally devalues your currency. As your currency gets devalued, it gets harder and harder for you to run a trade deficit because your currency is worth less than it was before. But something that is worth noting is approaching this from the perspective of going after every single country and trying to get your balance with every single country, even, is just kind of not even the way to approach it, even if you were trying and have an overall policy of even trade with everyone else, which is definitely what you want to do with the loud car outside. If you were running a sort of triangle trade, right, where you were giving country A bunch of goods, country A was giving country B a bunch of goods, and country B was giving you a bunch of goods, you would have both a massive trade surplus with one nation and a massive trade deficit with the other, while you're engaging in a little bit of a circle of trade, because each of you has the goods that the other one wants in a little bit of a circle here. And so even if you wanted to do this, it still doesn't make sense to try and fix this by means of approaching and attacking every single country with a tariff. But not only that, countries are going to retaliate, and China very much retaliated, much like how they did all throughout time kind of here, where they just are putting a larger and larger tariff on us in response to us putting a larger and larger tariff on them, and we are responding in kind as well here in the United States.
Thank you, Caroline. On the president's threat yesterday on social media to increase tariffs against China by an additional 50% in response to their retaliation, has he signed anything in terms of an executive order, any documentation around that? Will that additional 50% go into effect tomorrow?
They will be going into effect at 12:01 a.m. tonight, so effectively tomorrow, yes.
I think it's worth touching on motivations as well before we get into talking about this economic concept, because it's really important for realizing what your goals aren't being achieved by this strategy. And so if you know what you're aiming at, you can know when you both succeed and when you fail. And there's kind of three main reasons that get given, although a lot of reasons given out. The first, and namely kind of the biggest one, is stop the United States from getting ripped off. Now, it's not my perspective that running a trade deficit is getting ripped off, but if you characterize it as getting ripped off and you want to reduce trade deficit, this is definitely something you could do. The way it's getting done in terms of just tariffing everyone with whom you have a trade deficit, functionally what's going to happen is it's just going to reduce trade, especially as there are retaliatory tariffs. It will not be the case that this proportion is going to massively change because you're tariffing both ends of it. Instead, just trade entirely will decrease, and so the nominal level of the trade deficit is going to decrease. But another reason that gets given is the creation of jobs, and then finally the creation of manufacturing jobs specifically, or manufacturing specifically in the United States, as something that is wanted to be propped up. So talking about the jobs, the unemployment rate is just incredibly low right now, and there is, to some extent, loss of manufacturing jobs causing some levels of unemployment, but it's just not the case that there's a massive level of unemployment in the United States right now, specifically, or even, kind of any time, particularly with the exceptions of the 2008 crash causing massive unemployment, and also COVID causing massive unemployment. Now, the point on manufacturing, this is something that I think a lot of people don't really realize. Manufacturing in the United States is actually at an all-time high in terms of output. Manufacturing has never been higher. At the same time, manufacturing jobs are going away very quickly. And so this is not a function of lack of manufacturing in the US, although proportion to the GDP, the US does less and less manufacturing. This is a function of, instead, automation. Regardless of how much manufacturing increases in the United States, even if manufacturing doubles, triples, quadruples, 8x's as a result of these tariffs, automation is coming at such a fast pace that, it's just not deliverable for there to be a ton of manufacturing jobs because of the way automation works. Biden was lying when he said he was going to bring back all these, manufacturing jobs, and the idea that these tariffs can bring back a ton of manufacturing jobs is at best, just kind of some uninformed pie-in-the-sky idealism, because these jobs are just not coming back. Manufacturing has gone up, while jobs in manufacturing have just plummeted. And you can see here also there is this idea, as a proportion of our GDP, manufacturing is decreasing. You can see in 98, it was around 16%, and today this is around 10%. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, because as economy shifts to different types of economies, the previous type of economy tends to decrease in proportion of what's going on. Now a bigger share of the economy is stuff like tech, although there are bloated sectors like healthcare. And with tech, we had an agrarian world where all the economies were agrarian in nature. And then when industrialization hit, agrarian, oriented industries decreased in proportion. And then when the information kind of economy hit, industrial or material types of industries decreased as well. Now we're in a sort of, post information economy where we're in an intentional economy, a tech-based economy, and proportionally all the other economies, if you're on the cutting edge of what's going on in terms of development of technology and this type of stuff, all the other things are going to be proportionally less as new things arise on kind of the global scale. But regardless of that, in terms of nominal GDP, just nominal amount, billions of dollars produced, manufacturing is the highest it has ever been, and it will continue to increase in the United States, even as manufacturing jobs go down. And even if we return to having an economy that was 30% manufacturing, this is really important to note, even if we tripled the proportion of our economy that was manufacturing, jobs would still be going down as a result of automation. So the economic concept I want to talk about is comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is more important than just talking about specialization, which is something that is emphasized by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations as a means by which a country or a town or even an individual can acquire way more value for their labor by being really good at one thing. Comparative advantage demonstrates that even if you're better at everything as a nation, it's still worthwhile to trade with other nations. And by trading, both countries will be able to consume more goods overall in their populace. And by avoiding trading, you will decrease the amount that your population can consume, even if you switch to producing the other thing. And so, in order to do this, we're going to need to come up with some numbers. We're going to use the United States and also China. And let's say, hypothetically, that the United States is just as good at producing services as it is manufacturing, and is really good at both. United States, generally speaking, on a global scale, will be exporting services, technology, and these types of things, and will be importing manufacturing. And so I think something to the effect of saying that they're a little bit worse at manufacturing might make a little bit of sense. But in order to really highlight our point, we are going to be saying that we're just as good at services as we are at manufacturing. And so the argument would go, hey, why don't we just handle that manufacturing ourselves and allow, the other countries to do their own thing? And let's say hypothetically that the United States is just way better at both of these things than China, but China in particular does have a bit of an edge for themselves internally on manufacturing relative to services. So let's say for every Chinese laborer, they can produce 3 services or technology or 6 manufacturing, and for the United States, it's 12 at both. Well, for every United States worker, the opportunity cost of producing 1 services, or technology is exactly 1 manufacturing. This is what you have to give up because that worker could have produced manufacturing instead, and they're going to be producing services. For manufacturing, it's the exact same idea, but in reverse. For every manufacturing you produce, you give up 1 services. But we notice an asymmetry here with China. There would be no reason to trade with China if they just had even Stevens on both the same as the United States, because both would have the exact same opportunity costs. Instead, what we see is that China has a different opportunity cost. Every time they produce a service, they give up 2 units of manufacturing. Even though they're worse at the United States at producing both of these, and again, this is hypothetical, they are giving up more for every time they produce a service. So they would prefer to produce more manufacturing, but they have a certain amount of services they want. Conversely, of course, their opportunity cost of producing manufacturing is just half a unit of service. And so what we can instead do is we can create a situation where the United States will trade services to China, and China will in turn trade manufacturing to the United States. Now, let's clarify a little bit here. The United States has what's known as an absolute advantage in producing services, since it can per worker produce services better than China, and an absolute advantage in manufacturing because it can per worker produce more manufacturing. However, it has a relative advantage, a comparative advantage, in the production of services, specifically because the United States only has to give up 1 manufacturing to produce 1 service, whereas China has to give up 2 manufacturing in order to produce 1 service. So the United States is going to give up 100 manufacturing and is going to trade 100 services to China. China can give up to 200 worth of manufacturing for this trade and still be at least break even. So at 199, they're still getting positive value. We are, for this example, going to assume that they split the value and say that China is going to give up 140 manufacturing, and in doing this, the United States is going to be producing 40% more goods. And I know what you might be thinking, hey, that just seems like the United States is getting free stuff. Well, that's kind of how trade works. If someone's really a lot better relatively at producing a given thing, it really makes a lot of sense for them to specialize in that thing and then trade to other people. In this example, China's a lot better at producing manufacturing than it is services, so even though it's worse at both, it still makes sense to trade. Now, what they had to give up in order to produce these level of manufacturing is they didn't give up 140 manufacturing. Well, they did, but rather they gave up what they were producing in terms of their internal economy. They were producing services because this is what they want, and they gave up 70 services in order to produce this, right? In order to produce the 140 manufacturing, because they can produce 2 manufacturing per service, they gave up 70 services, right? And the United States, they gave up 100 manufacturing, and since they're equally good at both manufacturing and services, they gave that to produce 100 services, and so China here also receives 100 services. And so you can see when this trade takes place, both sides will get 40% more value out of the workers that are dedicated to producing surplus goods for trade than they would have otherwise. So both sides here are equally better off. This is what you get from trade, and the problem with starting a trade war where both sides tariff each other is you shut down the ability to gain value from comparative advantage, so you shut down the ability for you to specialize as a nation in the production of certain types of goods because you have to produce all the goods yourselves. Never mind that some goods are not really producible because coffee, for example, needs to be between a certain latitude, which the United States does not contain any territory in that latitude, so they can't really produce coffee, or rare earth minerals, which the United States doesn't have. It just strictly can't do some things. But this cuts you off from an enormous production of value, and the United States has historically produced a lot of services and exported those services. And so now the United States, if there's a massive trade escalation with other countries with increasing levels of tariffs, higher and higher and higher, the United States will not be able to gain value in this way by utilizing comparative advantage so that it can specialize and produce more services and export those services and receive manufacturing in exchange. Let's take a look at another example though. Alright, let's imagine an example here that is a little bit less balanced. In this example, roughly speaking, both sides are gaining the same proportionate value, although not the same absolute value, as the United States, from the perspective of the US, is getting 40 value, and China, from the perspective of the US, is getting 30 value. But let's imagine a scenario where there is a bit more of a trade deficit, and instead of trading out, instead of receiving for 100 services 140 manufacturing, the United States instead receives something like 180 manufacturing. Now, the opportunity cost of producing that manufacturing for China, which in order to produce one service needs to give up 2 manufacturing, the opportunity of producing 180 manufacturing is going to be 90 services. So we have that here, and then they are still receiving 100 services. And when we took a look at the consequences here, we will see that the amount of value that the United States workers are, increased by in terms of the consumer goods that are now available inside the economy. It's an 80% gain, and we see for China it's only a 10% gain. Now, in terms of what's going on, kind of regards to our trade deficit, is we are sending out more money than we are receiving, in terms of our consumers are paying more for Chinese goods than Chinese consumers are paying for US goods. And what normally happens in this scenario is when you are sending out more money, your currency starts to become more abundant in other areas, and it loses its value and it loses purchasing power until you are pulled back towards a scenario that is more in equilibrium, where you are kind of splitting the value, or something more close to this. The United States currency doesn't really devalue, and this is for reasons that are both beyond the scope of this video and also beyond a more complete scope of my understanding. But I think 2 very strong reasons why the United States currency doesn't devalue is that it is an international reserve currency. Other countries buy the currency just to hold on to it and use it to back their own currency, so the value of their own currency is more stable. But secondarily, international trade is conducted in dollars, primarily primarily. And so when this is the case, this makes it so that the dollars are always being perceived as valuable, and so the value of this can't drop. What would normally happen is the value of the currency would drop, the United States would not be able to buy as big a surplus, and the surplus would decrease. This is not the case, but what we have is a scenario where the United States is getting a lot of additional goods inside of its economy, and also their trade partners relative to a autarkic status quo where everyone produces their own goods for themselves, they too are gaining an advantage. But if we imagine this to be the scenario here, where let's say for each one of these economies they want to produce an equal amount of services and manufacturing, and let's say 100% of our manufacturing comes from China here, we can imagine a scenario where we have a total of 30 workers here, where each can produce 12 units of kind of value. We are producing with 30 of them, or you could think of that as 30 tens of million workers, which is pretty close to what the United States has, and we are ending up getting this 360,000, or actually less than 30 workers because we're trading for this. This is actually 280 worth, or 280 value that is being transmuted into 360 value per the value of trade increasing. But what we look at here is we are currently getting 180 and 180. If we delete or we get rid of the effect that we are getting from trade here, right? We would gain all of our services back and we would not trade them for manufacturing. So we would have 0 manufactured goods, and we would instead have 280 services. We are not refunded the full 180 worth of manufacturing, but rather the value we were trading for services. So now we are in a bit of a tailspin, because we now have an economy where there's a huge demand for manufacturing, and it is not being provided by other countries because it is now being provided, or it's just not being provided at all. Now, this is an absurd kind of hyper-polarized example in order to highlight the ideas, but we would recomp our economy, right, in order to become even, so there would be more manufacturing jobs in the United States as they try and achieve a balance between services and manufacturing, and we would see an eventual over the course of time, and this timeline would be extremely long because the timeline for producing multi-billion-dollar factories is enormous, and thinking that people are going to choose to invest or not over the course of 2 years or something like that, when the entire thing looks very volatile, is incredibly naive. Investors aren't going to want to plop down a $20 billion factory when it looks like it's really unclear whether there will be tariffs or not. But that's kind of like a secondary thing. Taking a look at our scenario, or it's like that's beyond that type of discussion's beyond the scope of what we're looking at here. We're trying to think of comparative advantage. We would hit a new equilibrium here, where instead of getting 180 of each good, we would be getting 140 of each good. Now, the United States would be producing more manufacturing themselves, yes, but the overall value that is getting consumed is going to be less. And this is what will happen if we effectively push an autarkic situation in the United States by shutting down trade with all of our trade partners, by constantly escalating retaliatory tariffs against their retaliatory tariffs, and escalate things up. We will have to produce everything ourselves. We will lose the ability to gain value by engaging in trade that allows us to gain value from comparative advantage. Even if we're better at producing everything, we still can produce value in this way. And we instead will have much less, services and manufacturing, both in terms of available goods for people to buy. So even in some sort of scenario where workers are getting paid more, which seems really unlikely because it's not like there's going to be more manufacturing jobs, in place, because manufacturing is going up, but the jobs are getting automated. Even if there were somehow like higher nominal wages for workers within the United States, which I also don't think that would be the case, but there's just way fewer services and goods to buy, which means the price of all these things is going to dramatically shift up. And so people are not going to be better off as things come down the pipeline, because there's just less stuff per person to go around, as the nature of your recomping your economy goes. And so this is kind of going to be the outcome when we look at removing the benefits that you receive from comparative advantage.